All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Using this one. Welcome to everyone in person and online to our 2055 Alternatives Analysis Workshop. For those of you who were here this morning and attended the MTP training, hope you had a good lunch wherever you were. Those that are online, hope you're refreshed and ready to go. This presentation and training isn't as long. It might be longer depending on questions and comments and things. And I want to make sure everyone is comfortable with asking questions along the way. I don't think we have too many stop for question slides in here. So as we're going along, if you have questions or anything, just flag me down and we'll go ahead and knock things out. I think everybody was here this morning or has been here before, so I'll skip over the emergency evacuation briefing stuff. Follow Campo staff are out if we need to leave for some reason. And of course, the bathrooms are out and to the left and down the hall a little bit. Let's go ahead and do a quick trip around the room, introducing ourselves. And then online, we'll just say welcome to everyone. We have you listed up on our big screen so we can see everybody who is online. But Het, why don't you take us away?
Het Patel, City of Raleigh, Transportation and Transit.
Gabriel Wilkins, City of Raleigh Transportation Transit as well. Bus Rapid Transit.
Bradley Kimbrell, City of Raleigh Transportation.
Kenneth Ritchie, City of Raleigh Transportation.
Aaron Joseph, Town Planner, Assistant Planning Director.
Sarah Williams, Mobility Manager at Campo.
Mike Rowe, Tyler Manabon.
Shannon Pohl, Town of Clayton, Engineering Project Controls.
Tanner Hazlett, Town of Roseville, Planner.
And of course, I'm Chris Lucasina with Campo. Go ahead and get rolling then. And this is not
working anymore?
Yeah. I don't know if it's just the battery. Our clicker is the battery. Hold on a minute. I'm gonna rob one battery for the other.
Well, actually leave it in there for a second. I think Chris is gonna try a different battery.
Our slide advancer is not cooperating for this afternoon, so please bear with us if you're online. Just thinking about it. Oh, laser is working. Nope.
Maybe it's not that battery that.
Yeah.
You know, it's going on.
All right, why don't we just go ahead and advance? Yeah, I'll just tell you when to move the slide forward. Will that work?
Mhm.
You can have your stuff back. Perfect. So we've already gone around the room. You can go to the next one. So for today, I think we do have one or two question slides, but again, as we're going through, if you have questions, please just flag us down and stop and discuss. You can raise your hands online or here, just give me a nod or something so I know you want to ask a question and we'll get rolling. Today, we hope that you have a better understanding of the MTP and the alternatives analysis in general, sort of the what. Who's involved in this step in the process, the who, and then how we do it, what the milestones are, and then hopefully a better idea of why this is relevant to you and your community's role in the overall process. And with that, we'll go ahead and get rolling. So some of this will be refresher for you from this morning that were in attendance to that training. But for the folks who have just joined us, we want to make sure everyone has at least a real quick baseline understanding. MPOs are regional transportation planning agencies. There's about 400 of us in the country, all of the urbanized areas with at least 50,000 people. We have 5 core functions that we're responsible for. The 2 highlighted there are to evaluate transportation alternatives and develop and maintain a regional transportation plan known as the Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So today, very specifically, we're going to talk about how we evaluate alternatives to develop that MTP. Go ahead to the next slide. Campo is all or part of 6 counties. It's all of Wake County and then portions of all the surrounding counties except for Durham. Chatham County is our newest county level member. We also had a small expansion in Harnett County that brought in Coates and Lillington, and a little bit of an expansion in Johnston County. Franklin and Granville, I believe we stayed the same with where our boundary was. So 6 counties, 21 municipal jurisdictions, and about 13 or 14% of the total North Carolina population. We continue to grow as a proportion of the state's population and who we do long-range transportation planning for and who we have to deal with when it comes to mobility and safety. Next slide, please. So next several slides are just what is the MTP? And then we'll get into the alternatives. Go ahead. This is our long-range plan for the region. It is required by federal law. We go through a process to integrate our land use planning that's done at the local level with transportation planning, and then we also have to ensure air quality does not get worse because of the decisions we're making. The plan covers all modes of transportation. There's a lot of engagement that happens along the way, both with local jurisdictions and the public. And ultimately, we'll arrive with a set of transportation projects, policies, systems, and strategies that are going to be what we try to implement to improve transportation over the next 10, 20, and 30 years. Okay. We update the plan every 4 years. It covers at least 20 years by law, but generally we are north of 25 years in our plan horizon. Currently, our adopted plan goes out to 2050. The plan update that we're working on right now goes out to 2055. We have a variety of inputs into the MTP. It starts with local transportation and land use plans. We also supplement that with regional level or sub-regional level transportation and land use studies, corridor studies, modal studies like a regional freight plan or regional technology study, those sorts of things. All of that flows into the MTP process. And at the end of it, we arrive with what is essentially a regional patchwork quilt of planning projects and programs that help us try to maintain or improve the quality of life in our region over the next 30 years. You can hit a couple of these. This is animated here. We don't need that. All right, so 4 high-level steps in our MTP update process: vision and goals. We are past that point. Currently, we're in the analysis and evaluation stage, which is what we're going to focus on this afternoon. Eventually, we'll be at a preferred scenario or preferred option for the plan that will then have to be right-sized against the budget of available funding and arrive at a final plan. Throughout the process, we have a lot of partners. We do a joint MTP development with our sister MPO, the now Triangle West MPO, but at the time this slide was written, they were still the DCHC MPO, and Doug Placzynski, the executive director from Triangle West, has joined us in person and is in the room with us. Say hello, Doug.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh, I thought I was going to say hi, Doug. So we've been working with Triangle West, formerly DCHC MPO, since the early 2000s. Initially, the 2 MPOs developed their regional plans, and at the very end, they got together and said, "How do we do?" And figured out that they needed to coordinate a few things. The next go around, 4 years later, 5 years later, they went ahead and actually developed the 2 plans together. And that single plan, although it had 2 separate adoptions, but the single document actually won a national award for regional transportation planning and coordination from the National MPO Association. And since that point, every year or every 4 years, we have continued to develop the plan together. Go ahead to the next slide. So just to give you a little better idea of what we're doing, here's a list of all the different steps and elements of the MTP. And a checkbox next to it means that we're doing it together, at the very least coordinated, if not literally together. DCHC staff, or excuse me, Triangle West staff might be working on something that applies to areas of Campo and vice versa in the process, in the technical side of the process. Engagement is being coordinated, trying to have as much of the same information, material, feel as possible. Another partner, Central Pines Regional Council, formerly known as Triangle J, Council of Governments. They also help with a lot of this regional coordination. They update and maintain our regional land use allocation model that's based on CommunityViz software that we'll talk more about this afternoon. And they also are responsible for administering the region's transportation demand management program, which every time we do the MTP update, that becomes a bigger and bigger part of our plan for the future. A lot of other folks involved, the public, private sector, the business community, federal and state agencies, transit operators, a variety of different interest groups from Wake Up Wake County to the Southern Environmental Law Center, to Ruritan clubs and Optimist clubs throughout the region that are very interested in what we're doing for regional transportation planning. So I understand that I have a correction to make on this list. We've had a couple of staff reassignments in the last couple of weeks, but for the most part, this is a list of all of our staff that are assigned to be liaisons to the local jurisdictions for the 2055 MTP process. And so many of you have already been talking with Kara, Crystal, Daniel, Kenneth, or Evan, and that will continue, I'm sure, through the rest of our process, whether it's reviewing projects to go into what we call our universe of projects, which is all of the future transportation projects in the region, regardless of whether they're selected for funding or not, to what your future land use is and how we've captured that in the regional land use allocation model. As we continue on, it'll be an opportunity to meet with them and review the results of the alternatives analysis. And as we move towards fiscal constraint, to continue to coordinate on what local priorities are and where they fit into the regional context. Stuck?
Yeah, it just disappeared.
Okay. Let me see if it'll let me do it. It let me do it. Awesome. So you guys are our partners in this as well. No, dang it.
What's going on?
Folks online, we're having some sort of lag in advancing the slides. So
Okay.
hang on one second as we try to re-share this and see how it works. Like 20 something, 16
Yeah.
maybe. Is it working?
Yeah, no, it's. Okay.
Okay. You can go to the next slide now. Okay, so where we're at in the process again is at this evaluation and an analysis and evaluation stage. So we are on the tail end of our deficiency and needs analysis, which has been presented to the TCC, I think twice now, and maybe 3 times, and the executive board once. This will be their second time next week seeing it. We've begun the technical work on the alternatives analysis that you're going to learn more about today. And as we step through that, eventually, again, we'll get to that preferred option, which will be the next step. So this all begins with our socioeconomic data and the Triangle Regional Model. So the first step in our forecasting process is to develop our population and employment numbers for the future. We call these socioeconomic guide totals. We develop those at a county level. And we actually basically take the state demographers' numbers and we go with those. Because we know they're the experts when it comes to socioeconomic data. We are not. And so we're happy to beg, borrow, and steal anything we can to make this process successful. So we take that from the county level and then we will utilize it in our tools to forecast and allocate growth between what's called our base year, which for this process, the base year is 2020, to our plan year, 2055, so that out horizon year. Those forecasts are then allocated down into what are called transportation analysis zones, or TAZs. And we'll talk a little bit more about those this afternoon as well. But then from there, we can actually forecast future trips between all the different TAZs out there. And thank you, Mike, for your quick response this morning. But we have about 3,300 TAZs in the model that will be forecasting everything for the 2055 MTP. On the screen there, you can see the difference in population in the blue bars and employment in the orange bars between our base year 2020 and our out year 2035 or 2055. So a growth of over 1 million people and about 800,000 new jobs are coming our way. That's a lot of folks and a lot more jobs that we've got to be ready for. So how do we do this? We do it with the beginning, we do it with the end in mind. So we will, throughout this year, be creating these different future growth scenarios that allocate the population and jobs based on future land use that you all have provided information on. And then we evaluate the differing impacts across the different scenarios based on that growth. In some cases, different ways that we might grow, along with what our different options for a future transportation network might look like. All of this culminates with an adoption by the two MPOs in late 2025 or early 2026. So the first part of this, one of the tools we use is Community Viz. It is a regional land use allocation model that is based on the Community Viz software. It is highly customized. If you went and bought Community Viz today and opened it up and looked at it, it would not look like what our model looks like. Some of it would look the same, but a lot of it is quite customized. Go ahead. The 5 basic inputs we need for this to run are the location of development constraints. Think of this as things like floodplains or the airport might be one, for example, that these are areas that will not develop in the future for some reason. The type of place for each parcel, this is done at the parcel level. So it's not what the land use is today, it's what it will be in the future. So your future land use plans, for example, are extremely important in this part of the process. Then we also ask you all to tell us what the development status is for all of these parcels. Is it developed the way it's going to be 30 years from now? Is it not developed, so it's undeveloped, but it will likely develop in the next 30 years, or it could develop? Is there something there now, but it's going to be denser or more of it, or it's going to be something totally different in the next 30 years? So those are things that we really care about for this part. And we also look at how suitable and how attractive each parcel throughout the region is. And we call this our land suitability factors. And then we also have, again, our inputs for the number of new jobs and the number of new people or households in the case of Community Viz that are going to be coming to our region. So just a little bit more about that suitability stuff. We use all these different suitability factors that we have. A couple of examples are up there on the screen. How close is a parcel to certain types of transportation investments? Think interchanges on a freeway or BRT stations for the future BRT system. The availability of water or sewer service in a particular area. How close is a parcel to a major activity center? And then is it inside of a planned growth area or not? All of these things will result in that heat map, and like any other heat map, more red, higher suitability scores you get, more blue, lower suitability scores you get. So for anyone who really wants to dive into the details about Community Viz, the local guidebooks and lookup tables are available on the Central Pines website. The URL is up there on the screen, and will also be in the slide deck that'll be made available after today. But they have everything from a handful of very short, sort of high-level, executive-level summaries about the different aspects of Community Viz to the full-on documentation that's well over 100 pages on that website. So Community Viz we use for what we call the development foundation, and it's that land use side of what we're thinking will happen in the future. And you can just see some of the examples up there on the screen from previous scenarios that we've done. The ETOD, which was equitable transit-oriented development growth, or M-Hub, which was mobility hub growth. These were different scenarios we've used in the past for something called the commuting corridor study. Very interesting study that we talked a lot about this morning. But it's just to give you a flavor of kind of what happens with community biz. Go ahead. The other side of this is the triangle regional model. So we take the output from community biz, which is a number of households and number of jobs in certain job category types. We input that into the triangle regional model, which is our regional travel demand model. This is a joint tool that is maintained by Campo, Triangle West TPO, NCDOT, and Go Triangle on behalf of our transit agencies, who every day become more and more larger and larger customers for the Triangle Regional Model output. This is a trip-based model. So for those of you who know anything about travel demand modeling, it's an enhanced 4-step model. Everybody else who doesn't know what I'm talking about, there's a whole training that we do from time to time on travel demand modeling. And we can dive into all of those details in that training. But suffice to say, this is a tool that we use to look at how many trips are going from one place to another and how they get there throughout the region. And this is how we forecast it. It covers all modes of transportation, with the exception of ferries and air. I wish we had a cool air forecasting tool, but we don't have one yet. I don't know if we ever will. Maybe when we have flying cars, we'll move into aviation forecasting. I'm not sure. But our MPO model covers parts of 3 MPOs. There's a little bit of the Burlington MPO that is within the Triangle Regional Model, but they do not maintain the model with us. They're not one of the modeling partners, but because they have grown eastward, they do come into the model area a little bit. 4 of our rural RPO partners, and then of course 11 counties and 40 plus cities and towns are within the Triangle Regional Model. So one of the really important things to understand about this is the TAZ, or Transportation Analysis Zone. This is how we subdivide out that very large region. Think of this as sort of like zip codes, but for transportation purposes. So these are small areas that we draw out, generally based on census geography or census boundaries, census block groups, or tracts. Generally, we try to maintain similar land uses within a single TAZ. We also try to balance the number of people and jobs, at least in the base year, in those TAZs. We try not to split things like neighborhoods, try to keep all of that together where it makes sense to do so. But the main purpose for doing this is to help simplify modeling and help us get a little better understanding of how travel is happening throughout the region. Go to the next slide. One other thing on the model, there is a lot of data that goes into this model, both on the land use side, which many of you are familiar with that process through community biz, but on the transportation side, we use a lot of information, whether it be regular recurring traffic counts at specific locations to help balance the model and calibrate the model. Sometimes we'll use streetlight data or probe data to help us with that. Then we also have a recurring travel survey done at the household level. We are one of the few regions in the country that do that. When we started doing that in 2016, I think we were maybe one of 2 in the United States that did a recurring travel survey. And there were, I think, 2 in Canada that would do it. And now there are closer to 10 or 15 that are doing it, because folks are understanding that there's a lot of value to getting regular real world data from the people that use the transportation system. So it's a very, very important part of our process, and continues to show value, not just to helping us with the regional model and forecasting, but with giving us snapshots every year or every other year about what's going on out there, and how things are changing. So as we were coming out of the pandemic, we had, while it wasn't maybe statistically significant for the entire region, we were able to get snapshots of what was happening with work from home, with changes in travel time of day, all sorts of fun stuff. Very interesting information. And we didn't talk about that this morning very much, but I did want to throw it in there because you all are here because you want to know a little bit more about some of this stuff. So household survey, onboard surveys with transit agencies on the vehicles themselves, traffic counts done by NCDOT or others, and then probe data. Those are all areas that we get data collected from to help us with our forecasting tools. And I'm looking at Mike to make sure I didn't miss anything really important in that realm, or I didn't misspeak.
Well, coming up for the 2025 update will be a university.
Oh, yes, and specifically to our region, because we have so many major universities, there is a university-specific survey that is done as well. Because travel in and around the university campuses is so unique that you don't see that in areas that don't have it, so. Thank you, Mike. Go to the next slide. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't cover that slide yet. Go back one, please. So the other side of what helps us develop a scenario is the Mobility Investment Foundation. Now, this is the transportation network that we pair with a land use scenario to develop a true alternatives analysis scenario. So this is something where we take all of the existing transportation network that's out there, we add to it in the future those projects from what we call our universe of projects, or all the possible future projects that we have on the books, to develop a transportation network, and then we test it against our future growth to see where it fails or where it succeeds and what tweaks we need to make. So for the 2055 MTP, known as Destination 2055, we have 4 alternatives analysis scenarios we are doing. The first one, deficiency and needs, we've talked a little bit about this morning, but we'll touch on again. Then the other 3 that we'll be doing are known as the plans and trends, shared leadership, and all-together scenarios. And I'll be getting into this as we step through the slide deck. So scenario planning for alternatives analysis, it's used to help us really understand where we are going to grow and how we're going to grow, and what the different choices we have to make for transportation investments will do to help us grow in the ways that we want to. Right? Sometimes we get it right. We think, oh, we think we're going to grow in this corridor, and so we need to, add new bus routes or widen the road or whatever it is. And when we run a scenario, we find out that's not where the traffic is going, and we need to do something else. That's really good and helpful for us to understand and think about to help us make better transportation choices for the future. A couple of key concepts for our alternatives that we want to talk to you about first: travel choice neighborhoods, reinvest neighborhoods, and mobility hubs. Go ahead. So in addition to that, we also have a few other things I want to make sure you know in case I use these terms. Anchor institutions and mainstays. Anchor institutions are places with extremely high concentrations of jobs and services. They have either high or moderate intensity, and some sort of what we would call an anchor institution that influence mobility in our region. So these are things like our major downtowns. So downtown Raleigh, downtown Durham, downtown Cary. They're things like NC State University's campus, Duke University, UNC. They're things like our major hospitals or RTP. RDU, I would even argue, falls into this category as well. The mainstays, those are also things that are regionally significant. They have concentrations of jobs, and they are generally those mid-sized towns and city centers. So think Apex, Wake Forest, Garner, Knightdale, Clayton, those downtowns, right? Those might be mainstays. There are other suburban centers as well. Think of something like Regency Business Park in Southern Cary. That's a good example, and there's lots of others out there as well. Reinvest neighborhoods. So these are areas that really began out of the requirements we have to fulfill Title VI, and have continued to evolve as conversations about equity and continue to happen, both here in the region and nationally. The next slide. So, travel choice neighborhoods. Here is a quick sample from the 2050 MTP. This map looks different for 2055. We are not done with that yet, but we will have that. But just so you understand what these are places, technically they're TAZs that we have selected from all those other all those 3,300 TAZs out there, where both roadway and high quality transit service investments are going to be available in these different future scenarios. They are a way to help us understand the relative significance of focused land use decisions, particularly those decisions that are probably different than what we have done for many, many years in the region and throughout the region overall. And when those are paired with specific transportation infrastructure investments, specifically transit, and how those policies could affect those neighborhoods. So maybe an easier way to think about this are travel choice neighborhoods are those neighborhoods, particularly where we have regional rail and 15-minute or better transit service. That's maybe an easier way to think about these areas. Okay. Go ahead. Reinvest neighborhoods. Again, we've defined these at a TAZ level so that we can report information out of our travel demand model. But these are where TAZs overlap with block groups that meet at least 2 of the 4 indicator thresholds that have been set with our criteria. So for the 2050 MTP, there were 735 reinvest TAZs out there, or reinvest neighborhoods. We now have 745 of these in our newest version of the model. Forgot what I was trying to say with this slide here for a second. But just to get a flavor of where these areas are. So these are TAZs where we have these thresholds met for race or ethnicity, low income, 0 vehicle households, or some other sort of specific characteristics. So for example, legally binding, affordable, restricted housing. Think of that as like affordable housing parcels or tracts that have some level of guarantee that they'll go to affordable housing. So it's not, oh, we think we'd like to have affordable housing there. It's the local jurisdiction has purchased that property specifically to be used for affordable housing. That's a really good example. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Next slide, please. And then mobility hubs. So mobility hubs were developed as part of the Opportunity Places, specifically the Opportunity Places scenario during our 2050 MTP effort. So this last effort, we have about 22 mobility hubs that we're planning to continue to use. These were basically defined as those areas that were located along existing major transportation corridors, near significant medical facilities. So not an urgent care or a doctor's office, but regional hospitals or health plexes, that sort of thing. Had at least 200 acres of developable or redevelopable land based on how things were coded in our community viz model. Had mixed use and intensity that would support potential future transit service, and had a minimum of 50%, would have a minimum of 50% increase in capacity for jobs compared to our other land use scenario, the community plan scenario. So these are the areas that would be planned to redevelop, maybe even beyond what your local land use plan was calling for. We have screened out those criteria that also coincide with the travel choice neighborhoods. So we've kind of screened a lot of those out, and we arrive with our mobility hubs. Okay. Any questions on any of those things as key concepts? Because I'm going to talk about them as we move forward. All right. So let's talk about these scenarios a little bit now, starting with the deficiency and needs scenario. So the way we've set this up is we'll have a slide here talking about what the development foundation was, and what that mobility investment foundation was. So what were the land use assumptions? What were the transportation network assumptions? And then after that, I don't know if we did it for deficiency needs, but for all the other scenarios, we then have a slide that kind of detail out the high level transportation projects and corridors that are included with improvements. If that makes sense, okay? So when you see the green letter, green highlighted letter on the left-hand side, that'll help you understand which of the development foundations we're using. The blue highlighted letter on the right, that's telling you what mobility investment foundation. So you can add those two together, and that matrix I showed you a few minutes ago with the different scenarios, they all match up. Okay. So the deficiency and needs scenario, which for those of you who were in the morning session, again, this is an unrealistic scenario, but it is useful for helping set a baseline to compare all of our other future scenarios to. For this one, we based the development foundation on future land use community plans. And that was gathered starting in 2023, going into 2024, and then an additional review later in 2024. I know a few local jurisdictions have continued to update their community viz data. So at a certain point, we close the door and we do our analysis. And if you've had changes since then, we've thrown that into some of these other scenarios. Go back real quick for me, thank you. On the mobility investment side, it's our existing and committed network, which is essentially the existing transportation network we have today, along with those projects that have been committed for funding in the next 4 to 5 years. It is a very unreasonable transportation network. What we're really saying with this is after 2029 or 2030, we will make no further investments in transportation all the way out to 2055. So we know that's not realistic, but it does help us test our network to understand where it might be deficient if we were to get all the growth that we think we're going to get. And then we use that to go check that universe of projects that we have, that big database of projects that we have, and we see where don't we have a project to address a future deficiency. And if we have it all covered, great. Then we continue planning. If we see that there's something missing, then we start looking, well, what do we need to do to cover that? Do we need to look at a widening, a new transit route? Maybe develop in a different way, and then we'll talk to the locals about that sort of thing. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, now you can go to the next one. All right, so this next scenario called the plans and trends scenario. We again are using the community plans based land use side of things. So the same, although I will tell you there have been a few updates that were made. I think Holly Springs was one of them that made some updates that are a little bit different for this land use scenario than for the deficiency and needs analysis. On the mobility side, we use what we're calling our trend investment scenario. And what that includes is state and federal funding in line with NCDOT's current forecast. We apply all of the constraints and limitations that are required under the current state transportation law known as the STI law or Strategic Transportation Investment Law. So what that means is any caps in funding or eligibility for certain categories of funding, any modal caps, any corridor caps. So in the law today, there is a financial limit to how much money can be spent in a single corridor in a single area. And that is very dependent on the overall budget. So it changes every 2 years, but there are caps. It's why we can't fund every single project on I-40 back to back to back to back because it violates the corridor cap. And there are a variety of others, a very, very long list of caps and limitations on how STI dollars can be used. The federal side, the federal funding, we maintain the current IIJA levels. So those are the funding levels that are in law today. We just carry those forward out to 2055. Transit investments are consistent with the county transit plans. So specifically for us, Wake Transit Plan, the currently adopted plan, not the draft new plan that's under development. Talk about that one in a minute. On the rail front, this is setting aside some funds that would be used in partnership to increase specifically intercity passenger rail. So think the Amtrak service that comes through. And really what this does is in this scenario is I think we add a couple of stations and one additional train per day in each direction. So not a lot, but a little bit. It's the most conservative of all of the scenarios. And then the local funding is as it's identified by all the local jurisdictions. Many of you have already confirmed for us that what you told us for the 2050 MTP still applies, and you may have some more updates, for new projects, but if there was a project that you thought a developer was gonna do, or you thought you would do through a bond 3.5 years ago, you've said that's still your thinking. Not everybody, but many of you have already told us that. So we are continuing with those assumptions in this trend investment scenario. And of course, we'll update it when we get to actual fiscal constraint again. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are really kind of wondering what this means, on the roadway front, it's completion of 540, the outer loop. It is widening or improvements pretty much on any road that has a shield on it. So interstates, US highways, or most, not all, but most of the NC shielded highways. And it has the smallest of all of our scenarios in terms of the level of investment in secondary roadways. So anything below the NC highway level. And that could be anything from Aviation Parkway to Kelly Road, and anything in between. Covered Bridge Road, I'll use something outside of Wake County, there you go. Those aren't ones that show funding, but just to give you an understanding of what type of roads we're talking about. On the transit front, again, adding a couple of stops to the intercity rail service, and then maybe one or two additional train sets to run throughout the day. We're still working with NCDOT Rail to really get a better idea. I think for the modeling, Mike, do you know, did we do one train morning, one train evening for that, or you don't? Oh, Gerald's online. Hey, Gerald, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Can you remind me for plans and trends, how many rail services there are running for each day?
I think, let me say 5. So we have the commuter rail from Wake Forest to downtown Raleigh, and then we have simulated intercity passenger rail services. So basically services that represent the Piedmont, the Carolinian, the Silver Star. So 5 branches. Yeah. No plans and trends.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna call on you again in a minute, so be ready, please. Then on the BRT front, we essentially include what's in the currently adopted Wake Transit Plan, which includes all of the original BRT corridors as well as the extensions to RTP and to Clayton. It also includes the north-south BRT that would run through Cary, essentially from the SAS area on Harrison and North Harrison, all the way through town, along Kildare Farm Road, down to the Regency and Cocoa Booth area. And then, of course, BRT service to Midtown or North Hills, depending on how you like to talk about it. And then all the rest of the frequent bus network and community funding area projects that are in the currently adopted 2030 Wake Transit Plan. So any questions about that scenario yet? We don't have results to show you. Today is more about understanding what's going into the scenarios. And then, when we get results, we'll be able to start looking at all that fun stuff. Okay, I'm going to keep going on then. The next scenario is what we call the shared leadership scenario. This scenario, we also use adopted community plans for the land use side of things. On the transportation side of the matrix, we start with everything we just talked about in the trend scenario, and then we add to that. So we assume additional state funding based on the recommendations that came out of the NC First Commission findings and recommendations. We start those in the second decade of our 3-decade plan. And then we also grow transportation funding at the federal level to keep pace with inflation. So essentially what we're doing there is we're saying, we're gonna keep the status quo, but we're gonna make sure that the value of those dollars don't get devalued because of inflation or anything else. High level, does that make sense to everybody? Go to the next slide. So what does this include? Everything from the trend scenario and, a few more NC highways. And then a little bit more on the secondary road level, but not a whole lot more. On the on the transit front, rail investment, this is where we start to get a little interesting. So we add some additional service and stops. And Gerald, if you're ready, can you run through what that includes again? Step away. Oh, there.
No, I'm here. I was trying to think. So for the major transit investments, we basically have what's in the plans and trend scenario. In addition to the high frequency bus services, but we do add the rail investment, as you point out, where we're going from Western Durham all the way down to, no, I don't think the shared leadership scenario, we do go from Western Durham to the Clayton area. We don't expand to Powhatan. We have the I-40 BRT. We also have the Apex to RTC BRT in the shared, no, sorry, that's in the altogether scenario. And yeah, so what we have identified here in the bullet points are pretty much just the enhancement of those fixed guideway services.
Yeah, so in terms of rail, I think we add in Clayton, Garner, Morrisville, Apex here. And I think we up the service a couple of frequencies as well. Can go to the next slide. So any questions about plans and trends or shared leadership so far and sort of what they are and how they work? No?
Just a real quick one. I think you mentioned it between the plans and trend scenario. The recent Wake Transit Vision Plan update work that's happening is not factored into it fully. I think it is in some ways because I think some of the projects identified are in the vision plan update as well.
Yeah.
Will there be an opportunity that when the vision plan update is done, some things can be modified in here or?
Yeah, so what Ed's question is about is simultaneous to this effort, although it will be done earlier, the 10-year Wake Transit Plan update is going on. It'll take it to 2035. That's very intentional in how we set up Wake Transit planning so that it will be our first decade for most of the transit in Campa, which is mostly in Wake County. And then we'll add to it the things that are outside of Wake County as well. So the plans and trends had the plan, the old plan. Shared leadership has a lot of the new plan, but not everything quite. And then you'll see in a moment when we talk about what's called the altogether scenario, we'll have all of that. Now, we have to make decisions when we have to make decisions. So some of the things that are changing for the Wake Transit Plan based on feedback in the last couple of weeks, we might not capture that here, but we would update that when we get to the preferred scenario then. Yeah, if it's in the Wake Transit Plan, then it's going to be in the MTP. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So the altogether scenario, this is where we do get a little bit different. So on the land use side or the development foundation side, it's built on many of the base assumptions from the community plan scenario, but we've added a few things here. So this is where we're going to go a little bit beyond our comfort zone, if you will, right? So with anchor institutions, we assert more job growth around our anchor institutions. For our mobility hubs, we increase the density of those areas, right? That's where we could go up to 50% higher than what your local plan might call for. Up to that. It might not actually be that when the allocation occurs, but it could be up to that much. Affordable housing. So this is where we go out and we identify those publicly owned properties near frequent transit service areas, so those travel choice neighborhoods. And we will assert that the affordable housing would happen in those areas. And then we also look for some level of equitable transit-oriented development. So we increase densities in the areas that are within, I think it's half a mile. Yeah, half a mile of those frequent and high quality transit lines. So we basically override your land use plans in these areas, just in these areas. And we say, we're gonna try and focus more development in those areas and more growth in those areas.
So that doesn't come with a subtraction of low density elsewhere. It's just purely additional.
Correct. So we don't take the results of the community plan scenario and then change them. We take the assumptions and we change those. And then we do a new community biz run and we see where we let the chips fall where they may, right? And then we take all that. And then again, we take that output and put it into the travel demand model. So on the transportation side, we have what we call our complete communities investment, mobility investment foundation. So we're taking what we had in our shared leadership scenario, and then we're adding to that. So we're adding additional funding, much like we talked about this morning. We don't have to say exactly how we're going to get that additional funding, but we take a certain amount of additional funding and we put it into this scenario. That revenue would start in the second decade and carry through the third decade and beyond. We will let that be driven by an investment mix. So our default is to start with what we use for the 2050 MTP, which was that alternative 3 I showed you towards the end of the presentation this morning. But ultimately, the board will have to decide whether they want to go with that or something different when we get to fiscal constraint. But we feel like that does have some level of standing in that they've already adopted it, number one, and we've been talking to them about this a little bit for a few months now, and we haven't had any pushback. So we feel more comfortable using that. And then we also, I think in that scenario, we assume additional revenue for transit beyond just the Wake Transit plan. So some of this additional general transportation revenue could also go to transit. So let's talk a little bit more about how especially on the land use side, it's a little bit different. So this is a very mechanical change that we make, right? We don't just close our eyes and point to something. So again, we use the community plans as the starting point. Around those anchor institutions, we asserted more development, right? So again, we up your densities and we say you're going to develop more around NC State University, for example, or downtown Raleigh, downtown Cary, or RTP, or whatever it is. With the mobility hubs, we say the whole idea here is that you're more intense and you're more mixed use. So whatever you have coded from the local side, we're going to replace that with mixed use and have density put around that. Want to be really, really clear here. By assuming this, it does not require the local jurisdictions to do anything. But it certainly will provide you with really good information to make some future decisions that might be a little bit different than what you had in the past. Does that make sense? Okay. We also feel very confident about this approach because we have vetted this with Federal Highways and they are comfortable with us taking this approach because it ensures that while we make some different assumptions than our local land use plans, we are still consistent, primarily consistent with our local land use plans. Does that make sense? Okay. Think of this as a regional what if, but it's not so far-fetched that, what's the old Casey Kasem saying? Keep reaching for the stars, but keep your feet on the ground. That's what we're doing here, okay? In our frequent transit corridors, AKA our travel choice neighborhoods, it is all coded transit-oriented development. And we look at any parcel that could get development in the future, and we make sure it's TOD and we up the density on it a little bit. So for example, in the Six Forks corridor, I think Raleigh has 15-minute service that goes north of North Hills in the future. We don't go in and say, oh, all this single family residential along the corridor, we're going to scrape it off and build towers. That's not what we're doing here. What we are doing is any of the parcels along that corridor that were coded as underdeveloped or redevelopable or undeveloped at all, we will go in and say those will be TOD and they will have density that's appropriate for a 15-minute or better service, okay? I know a few years ago, there was a lot of confusion about that. So that's why I like to use that example because, we try to be realistic about this, but still try to, do something a little more here. And then again, the affordable housing, it's all about those undeveloped public lands that are available through the GIS resources that we have that have been previously identified. Central Pines tries to keep a running database of all of that, so we use that. So those are the four main changes that we make to community plans. They are very localized to these categories and to these areas. And then we can see what that might do for us. Does that make sense to everybody? Go to the next slide. So on the roadway or on the transportation side, the main difference here is I think in this scenario, we have pretty much touched all of the shielded roads, including all those NC routes that maybe we didn't have enough funding in the other categories to get to. But here, the biggest difference on roadway is a higher level of investment in secondary roads, particularly in complete streets improvements on secondary roads. But we want to be really clear when we talk about this. This scenario does require the assumption of additional revenue, right? So particularly with the board, we want to be really clear that if they like this scenario, that also means they like using the idea of additional revenue, and we're going to have to include that somehow in the plan. On the transit side, it's on the rail front, it's all the things that we talked about in the shared leadership, plus the expansion of the regional rail concept fully into now Triangle West, TPO, and Johnston County. Potentially, we haven't really talked much about Franklin County, but potentially up there, we'll have to see how the funding runs when we actually do fiscal constraint there. BRT, it's everything we've already talked about, plus the addition of a Western Wake north-south BRT corridor. What we are modeling is in the Davis Drive corridor, running basically from Apex all the way up to RTP. Technically, it's running to the, I believe it's the Triangle Mobility Hub, where it will also intersect with the Western BRT corridor coming out of Cary and Morrisville, and then would also be able to take them into RTP proper. Additionally, we also have what we are going to model, the first runs anyway, will be BRT service in the US 70 or Glenwood Avenue corridor. Running from our perspective here on the eastern side from probably the North Hills area or Midtown area through Crabtree Valley and out to Briar Creek, and then turning and running, splitting and running to Durham along US 70 and to the and back towards Morrisville and RTP through the airport. We felt like that was a really good way to, we get a lot of comments. You probably get a lot of comments about why aren't we serving the airport? Why aren't we serving the airport with transit? So we're doing more to show how we can serve the airport with transit, and at least what benefits that might give us, and how much it might cost to do so. So those are, I think, some of the key additions or differences for this altogether scenario compared to the other scenarios. So any questions about any of that? Yeah.
Assuming at this point, there are no changes happening to the scenarios in terms of running them, because I guess we've gotten guidance through the TCC and the executive board on the scenarios at a high level.
High level, you are correct. Details, it just depends. Like when we started putting all these together, there's a lot of scrambling because we start getting lots of inputs all of a sudden. So the FAST study, for example, we've been coordinating with them. So some of the station areas they've been thinking about for the 70 BRT corridor, we're coordinating with them and moving things around. That's a good example.
Well, I think the question was more probably even, if you look at like the larger chart you have of baseline plans and trends and leadership, or from a development perspective, they all have the same backbone.
Yeah.
And then the only difference is the altogether one where you do add the additional layer of the mechanical driven components on the land use side. And maybe it's not for this MTP, but could be for a future one. But if there would be benefits of thinking more about those land use side of things to bring into maybe a hybrid scenario also that focuses on somewhat everyone's comfortable with. Again, I understand like you can't have everything on both of those scenarios because then they're all the same. There's not a lot of differentiation. But maybe just try to bring in some components of that into an alternative.
That is a great comment, and I feel like you're looking ahead on my slide deck here. So once we get through these slides, one of the you'll notice we're pretty close to being through the slides for today. We wanted to make sure I think we scheduled this to go till 3 or 3:30. Want to make sure there's plenty of time for any questions or discussion or anything. I want to show you a couple of tools as well. But one of the other things that we did this time that we haven't done in the past is last year we went through what we called the learning scenarios, where we took some very, very different scenarios and put them together and tested them. We ran them through community viz, we did trial demand model runs, and we had results. We talked about that with the TCC and the executive board last year, like last spring of 24, I think. And then we talked about it. We kind of refreshed everyone again because it had been a few months, I think in October or November. So I have, a lot of that information. I'll be happy to stay after the rest of the slide deck to walk you through some of that. But the idea there was when we get to the alternatives analysis stage of the MTP, we have a very tight window of time, right? Because you have to do things sequentially. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot you can run concurrently when one depends on another thing. But one of the questions we always get is, well, these scenarios, like on the land use side, is sort of white, off-white, and light beige, right? And so why don't we do things that are more different? Well, that's what we did. And so one of the key things there was from all the feedback from those very different scenarios, we took away 6 things. And we've tried to integrate those 6 things into these categories or into these scenarios, right? So some of that is that focus on the travel choice neighborhoods in the altogether. I think in all of these scenarios, except for plans and trends, we're running the work from home at roughly 30%. Am I remembering that wrong, Mike?
Got it changed to work
Okay, so I think
off that pre-scenario into any of the alternatives.
in the plan, we've only done plans and trends so far, right? So yeah, so we have been talking about which of the scenarios to put that in. I feel like that's probably going to be an altogether thing. Some of the affordable housing as well. So we've identified those sort of 6 key elements, and we're trying to put those into those scenarios. And we can talk. I was going to talk more about that towards the end here, but does that help answer your question?
Yeah,
Okay,
it does.
Good. So at the end of this, we have a ton of performance measures, and we talked a lot about that this morning. But what we'll try to do for everyone is focus in on a few key measures, and they're very similar. So these are the ones we use for the 2050 MTP. Average auto commute, delay by MPO, the number of highway miles in each MPO, transit service mileage, ridership, jobs near transit, gas consumption, and then how much funding is required. So those are some key things that we've heard over time that folks are interested in understanding. We have a few more, we have a lot more performance measures, of course, but these are probably the ones we'll highlight a lot of for folks as we get results. And then we'll have full performance measure results for all the scenarios when they're all done. But this is one of the ways that we'll try to work to help everyone understand where those differences are in what we're getting with each scenario. One of the other things is we continue to try and have a focus on some of the important trip origins and destinations, or where trips are coming from and where they're trying to go to. So you can see here just a few examples of some of the things that we'll be looking at. So TCN is Travel Choice Neighborhood. In the 2050 process, that we had a lot of board members who were very, very interested in this concept. So we did a lot of comparison of what things looked like across the scenarios, specifically for those travel choice neighborhoods. And you can see on the upper left, that was population and employment growth in the different scenarios, specifically in the travel choice neighborhood areas. Not everywhere, but just in those areas. And of course, altogether is where you saw the largest growth there. When we did this last time, shared leadership and altogether both used the opportunity places land use scenario. So you can see their growth is very, very similar. I think the difference was very, so small you can't really even see it on the chart there, but there was a little bit more in altogether. On the upper right, you can see the change in the allocation of dwelling units, which is households, but thus population, and employment between our preferred scenario, which was the altogether land use, and the plans and trends. So you can see that in our preferred scenario or altogether scenario, you saw an increase in population and households in the travel choice neighborhoods and a decrease in those areas when you compare them between the two scenarios. In other words, the assumption did what we thought it was going to do, and it put more growth. It concentrated more of our future growth in those travel choice neighborhoods, which is something that the TCC and the executive board 3.5 years ago said they very much wanted us to try and do. So still had lots of growth happening all throughout the region, but you specifically saw that there was growth in those areas. And then at the bottom here, just a few other metrics, wanted to give you a good flavor. So we looked at vehicle miles traveled, we looked at hours of delay, we looked at mode split, and you can see from our deficiency and needs analysis, plans and trends, shared leadership, and altogether moving left to right, where those things happen. What I thought was very interesting was our non-motorized mode split was the highest in the deficiency and needs analysis and the lowest in the altogether. And the only thing I could ever come up with was, I don't know why it did that. We still don't, I think we gave up on trying to figure that out, but we felt like the data was saying that in the model, but we felt like that's not actually what was going to happen. And we felt like that was more of a limitation of the tool 4 years ago than anything else. Okay, you can go to the next slide. So as we analyze all of our alternatives from this morning, you saw this exact same slide, but again, this is not meant for you to actually read it. It's just to give you a flavor of a variety of different data points and reports that we will generate, everything from tomato maps for every scenario to, we'll start with a pre-selected set of metrics. But if there's things that you all say, hey, can you tell me this or that about a scenario? We'll absolutely try to do that. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that's where we were comparing what happened with some of our performance measures relative to the different scenarios. So an up arrow means something increased, a down arrow means it decreased, and then green meant that was a good thing, and red meant that was a bad thing, right? So if you saw an arrow go down and it was green, that means we reduced something that we wanted to reduce. If you saw it go down and it was red, that means we wanted it to increase and it actually decreased, and we should go try and figure out why that is. So again, a variety of different ways to slice and dice the data to try and understand what's happening. Go to the next slide. We do have some specific performance measures that we are required to include. Some of those are back or rear facing, so things like crash data. That's always looking at what has happened, not what might happen. And then some of these other ones, for the purposes of the MTP, it's more financial. So what are we, we're assuming if we spend more money on safety projects, that safety will improve, or infrastructure condition will improve if we spend more money on maintenance and operations. So we look at all those things as well. So once we get through all of that, we arrive at our preferred scenario. Go to the next slide. Again, this is more for the folks who weren't here this morning, but once we have a preferred scenario, once we've selected scenarios that we want to be our preferred scenario, whether it's a hybrid or whether it's just one of those scenarios, let's go with it. We'll do an initial cut of fiscal constraint, very high level. We will use our payback period to do a first cut of these projects. And so that is primarily based on travel time savings. So we take the cost of a project, we take the benefits of the project measured in travel time savings. We see what the economic benefit is of that travel time savings, and then we assign how long it takes for that project to pay off the cost of itself in terms of economic, output. And things range from, less than a month of probably even hours of payback, very, very quickly because it was extremely high scoring, to thousands of years to pay itself back. And we'll do a cut, right? So in the 2050 MTP, we cut things at about the 3,000 year mark. If it had a payback period of greater than 3,000 years, we said you're in the CTP and you're no longer in consideration for the MTP for funding. We gotta draw a line somewhere, and we hemmed and hawed on it literally, I think, for 2 weeks. And I finally just looked at Alex and I said, we're going with 3,000. We don't have enough money for 1,000. I think if we run 3,000, we'll get the rest cleaned up when we do full fiscal constraint. So once we do that and we have a preferred scenario, the next thing we're going to do is actually apply true fiscal constraint. And the first time we do that, we do it with our traditional funding, which is state and federal funding primarily, as well as local funding, right? That local funding being local community bonds or developer activity, that sort of thing. And when we do that, we will actually try to use our new roadway prioritization tool. So that goes beyond just travel time savings. It looks at safety benefits, it looks at multimodal benefits, it looks at connectivity, all the things listed up there on the screen. We feel like that generally gets us to about the 90% right mark. And then we'll have conversations with you all. What are local priorities? So very good conversation in between the meetings. We had a project that, 4 years ago, there were 2 projects in Clayton where I feel like one either had a better score for travel time savings. So we said that's a second decade project. The other one's a third decade project. Now I think we're going to be flipping that for the new year because there's new activity going on. And so those priorities have shifted. We're able to account for that, right? We like to use tools to make our job easier, but at the end of the day, we can override those things where we need to. And then we also look at project impact. So we judge, if we've got a very highly beneficial project in one area, but it's got some negative impacts, we're going to look at that a little bit and see what we need to do. The prioritization tool is new. We have never used this in our MTP before. It was developed last year with some consultant help. And one of the key things we have to do to make this all work at the end of the day is we have to weight the different criteria. So we've not done that yet. And our plan is to use the TCC subcommittee, probably starting that in May and June, to flesh out what we think that should be. Of all the criteria, how much weight should we put on congestion versus safety versus multimodal versus connectivity or whatever it is. And then we'll use that weighting once the TCC blesses it to actually be the sorting hat, if you will, on how the projects work. Any questions on that?
Is there already a subcommittee or you mean just the full TCC?
There is a subcommittee, yes, and we used to have many subcommittees for the TCC, and then we realized it's all the exact same faces that show up, and we were pushing quorum issues with that. So we said, let's just have one subcommittee for the folks that are interested in something, and when the TCC kicks something to the subcommittee, we'll activate it. Spot and MTP are 2 where we automatically, at this point, say, we know you need to kick it to this, so we're just going to go ahead and set up the meeting. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Next slide, please. All right, so same example I used this morning for those of you who are on, but just to kind of hone in on this a little bit, this is the multimodal effectiveness calculations. We get to the bike walk score from walkscore.com. We get the transit improvements from the project travel time savings and the number of transit routes that use that corridor. And then we plug those into the spreadsheet and the database and it scores it. These are just 2 examples, I think, from our currently adopted MTP and how they kind of score across those subcategories. So walk score, bike score, then the access to transit score, and then the final multimodal score. So that's all used to figure out where a project is going to land across the different buckets of the MTP, the horizon years, right? First decade, second decade, third decade, or unfunded CTP. So vision plan, if you will. These are the colors we use. These are ADA compliant colors for our map. We learned the hard way. We had a TCC member who was colorblind and came up and told us right before we adopted. We said, "Well, we could do something about it. We hadn't thought about that. Let's go see this, see if we have something." And sure enough, the access board had an ADA compliant color ramp for colorblind folks. There's actually several because there's different types of colorblindness, it turns out, but this is what we've chosen to go with. Green represents the first decade. Yellowish orange represents the second decade. Blue is the third decade. And then the thinner gray lines, those are the CTP. So they're in the vision plan, they're in the adopted CTP, but they are not funded in the MTP. In other words, those projects could not move forward for state or federal funding until they were amended into one of the funded horizon years of the MTP. Our schedule, so we are actually a little bit ahead, which I'm very, very happy about. That never, ever happens. I keep waiting for something to happen. But we have, we are a little bit ahead on alternatives analysis. And I'm hoping at the April TCC, we will have not one, but hopefully 2 scenarios to share. But once these start coming out, we'll be loading them on the website and they'll be out there. So I strongly recommend you all who are interested, just keep an eye out on our website because it'll be constantly getting updated here in the next couple of months. Just a reminder on everyone's Campo staff liaison. So these are the folks that will work with you all to collect data and then to review the results. And they'll be scheduling meetings. I think they've gone around to everybody once or twice already. And between now and the end of the summer, I think you'll be looking at 2 to 3 more meetings with them as we step through the process. So that'll be a really great opportunity when they talk to you about reviewing all the results of the alternatives analysis to really hone in and look at what the results mean for your specific communities. And primarily we're looking for, do you think the growth, in population and employment seems reasonable? The tomato maps, is anything surprising about that? Do you see congestion where you weren't expecting it, or you don't see any traffic where you were expecting it, whatever the case may be. So that is the end of the slides. As I said, we can also go through some of the materials and results from those learning scenarios if folks are interested in that. When we first set this up, that was something of interest to a few folks. When we first started talking about doing this session, but we're further along now in the process, primarily because we got snowed out. I do still want to offer that opportunity for anybody, but before we get to that, any questions or comments on anything that's been presented so far? Okay, well, I've either bored everyone or adequately covered the material. One other thing I do want to point out on our website, the deficiency analysis results are there. So you can see the growth at the TAZ level for population and employment. You can see the tomato maps online. You can zoom in, you can click on anything. It'll tell you, I think we've got, Mike, do we have volume and delay for the network or no? On the tomato map layer? Do you remember what attributes we have on there? I'm gonna look right now. Looking at this last night and just forgot what we had on there. Hold on a second.
Thought they were just VOC and volume.
VOC and volume, okay. So it's all ArcGIS Online based. There are PDF versions, and the PDF maps, we also included some isochrone or travel time maps that were focused on downtown Raleigh, and I believe we did RDU. So it shows you from those points how far you can get in a certain amount of time, 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour, what have you. in the base year and in the future. Yeah, so our online mapping right now on the transportation network side, it'll tell you what that road would look like in the future. Is it 2 lanes? Is it 4 lanes? Is it a freeway or not? What the speed limit would be on it. Then we have daily flow, total flow daily, that's volume, right, Mike? And then we have the volume to capacity ratios out there for by time of day. So you can see is that maybe it's congested at a certain point in the day, but it's free flow the rest of the day. These maps tend to show, I think, the worst time period of the day in what we're showing online. And then, of course, it'll show you what those forecasted volumes are in the future as well. And then on the TAZ side, so the household, the socioeconomic data side, well, it shows you what is the base year or 2020 number of households and population, as well as employment across the different employment categories we have. So we divide employment into industry, office, retail, what we call service high, and service low. And if you'd like, we can get you a list of all the NAICS codes that are assigned to each of those categories. I know most folks don't really want to know that level of detail, but again, just we have it if you're interested in it. And then, of course, total employment and population for the base year and the future year for every TAZ out there. So you can really zoom in and explore the data. In particular, if you see something that looks odd, please reach out to us if we haven't already talked to you about it. And we can work to understand what's going on and whether there's a mistake or an error or it's a result that makes sense based on the inputs. And it's just we need to think differently about those assumptions. Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions, we'll be around for a while. Anybody either online or in the room that would like for us to run through some of the learning scenario information, I'm happy to do that. If you have any other questions or anything you want to chat about, we'll be here for a little bit. But if not, then I want to thank everybody for their time, and we look forward to working with you all as we step through the alternatives analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you.